Okay, so today we are diving deep into USAID, which is the
UA.
U.S. Agency for International Development.
Right.
And they pretty much handle all of America's global efforts to help other countries
Yeah.
with things like poverty and disease outbreaks and even just keeping countries stable.
Uh-huh.
And we've got this fascinating report that we're looking at
Okay.
called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. And
Interesting.
it's giving us this totally different way to think about USAID from a conservative perspective, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, this report doesn't just say USAID is doing great.
Right.
It actually criticizes them quite a bit,
Uh-huh.
saying that they've kind of strayed from their original mission and purpose,
Got it.
and they have all these recommendations for changes that they
Wow.
think need to happen, and some of them are very bold.
I see.
So to help us unpack all of this, we have an expert in the house today.
Happy to be here.
And you've spent years studying this kind of stuff.
I
So what's the big takeaway here? What's the core message of this report?
Well, the big thing is that they say USAID needs to be way more focused on actual U.S. foreign policy goals.
Okay.
Like they see a disconnect between what USAID is doing and what, America wants to achieve on the world stage.
Right.
And their solution is to basically put the person in charge of USAID
Sure.
in charge of all U.S. foreign aid.
Got it.
So everything is streamlined and working together.
So it's like they're saying that foreign aid shouldn't just be about being charitable.
Right.
It should also be a strategic tool
Exactly.
to achieve American goals.
Mm-hmm.
I can already see how this could be controversial.
Cocktail.
They also seem to have a problem with China,
Yes.
and specifically their Belt and Road Initiative, right?
Yes.
Which they call debt trap diplomacy.
That's right.
So what's that all about?
Basically, they're saying that China is using loans and investments to kind of get developing countries,
Yep.
especially in Latin America and Africa, in a position where they owe China big time.
They're in debt to China,
Exactly.
and then China can leverage that debt to get what they want.
Exactly. They even go so far as to say that China now controls most of the rare earth mining in Africa,
Wow.
which is a big deal because, rare earth metals are essential for all sorts of high-tech stuff.
Right, our phones, our computers.
Exactly, everything.
So this Belt and Road Initiative, is that mostly in Africa?
It's big in Africa, but it's also huge in Latin America.
Oh, wow.
Actually, the report says that 25 out of 29 Latin American countries are part of this initiative.
Look, most of them.
It is.
Wow.
Yeah, and we're talking serious money here.
Okay.
Like $138 billion in loans in Latin America and $160 billion in Africa just since 2005.
That's a lot of influence.
It is. It's a huge amount of money.
So the report is basically saying that China is using its economic power
Right.
to gain political influence all over the world.
Exactly. And they're not afraid to say it.
Mhm.
It's a pretty direct critique.
Okay, so then they bring up the Trump administration's Clear Choice Initiative,
Uh-huh.
which was, if I remember correctly, all about drawing a line between how the U.S. approaches development versus how China does it.
Exactly.
So they're saying America needs to be more upfront about saying, hey, our way of doing things based on freedom and free markets
Mhm.
is better.
Yeah, they think that's the key to winning hearts and minds around the world.
Okay, so is that what they want to see from USAID?
Absolutely. They want America to be more assertive
Okay,
and to really promote its values through its development work.
so less about just giving money and more about using aid strategically.
Exactly. They want to see a return to that kind of approach.
And I bet they're not too happy with the Biden administration's approach.
Not really. They think Biden has let things slide, and they want to see a more kind of forceful approach.
Got it. So that's the big picture stuff, but they also get into some very specific issues,
They do.
like climate change. And this is where things get really interesting. They basically say that Biden's focus on climate change within USAID is doing more harm than good.
They're pretty blunt about it.
Really? Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, they argue that these climate-focused policies are actually hurting poor people.
Okay.
And they use examples like Sri Lanka,
Okay.
where this ban on chemical fertilizers, which were, seen as bad for the environment,
Right.
actually ended up causing food shortages and political unrest.
Oh, wow.
And then there's South Africa,
Okay.
where they say the cost of switching from coal to cleaner energy is just way too high for a country with so many other problems.
So they're basically saying that going green can sometimes backfire,
Exactly.
and that maybe there are other ways to help developing countries
Uh-huh.
that don't involve forcing them to adopt expensive new technologies.
Especially if it hurts their economies.
Right, and that might actually make things worse for the people they're trying to help.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure.
It is. It's a very different perspective than what we usually hear.
Right. It definitely challenges the conventional wisdom.
Okay. Well, that's a lot to think about already.
It is.
And we're just getting started.
Yeah,
There's a lot more to unpack in this report.
there is.
So we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back and dive into some of the other big issues.
Sounds good. So the report gets into how USAID actually works, like day to day.
Okay.
And they seem to think that if they change who USAID works with
Okay.
and how they spend their money,
Uh-huh.
they can make the agency way more efficient.
So less bureaucracy, more bang for the buck.
Exactly.
They keep talking about moving away from those big international NGOs.
Right.
What's the deal with that? Are those groups just not effective?
Well, they're not saying they're totally useless,
Okay.
but they think USAID depends on them way too much.
Okay.
And that these big NGOs are often really slow-moving and
Yeah.
out of touch with what's really going on.
Okay.
And they think a lot of money gets wasted.
Right. Just on administration and overhead. So instead, they want to give more power to local organizations,
Yes.
especially faith-based groups.
Right.
So what's the logic there?
Well, they have a couple of arguments.
Okay.
One is that local organizations just understand the communities they serve a lot better.
Okay.
I mean, they're already there.
Right. They're on the ground.
Exactly. They know the culture.
Uh-huh.
They speak the language.
So they can get things done more effectively.
That's the idea.
And what about the faith-based groups specifically? Why them?
Well, they say faith-based groups have a really strong track record of working with vulnerable populations.
Okay.
They're often deeply rooted in their communities,
Uh,
and people trust them.
so they can make a bigger impact.
That's what they're arguing.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem.
No.
It's about finding the right partners who
Exactly.
can actually make a difference.
And they use PEPFAR as an example.
PEPFAR.
The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
Oh, right.
Under Trump, they shifted a lot of their funding to local groups.
Okay.
Like, it went from about 25% to almost 70%.
Wow. That's a big shift.
Yeah.
And they see that as a success.
They do. They think it made PEPFAR much more effective.
Interesting.
So that's kind of their model for how they want to reshape USAID.
Focus on local partners.
Right.
Okay, so what about global health?
Yeah, that's another big one.
They must have a lot to say about that.
They do. They want to see a major overhaul.
Really? What kind of overhaul?
Well, they're really focused on results.
Okay.
They want to see USAID actually measuring what they're achieving.
So not just how much money they're spending.
Right. But what they're actually accomplishing with that money.
Makes sense.
And to do that, they say USAID needs to be much more data-driven. They want them to collect and use a lot more information about their programs.
So you can track their progress
Exactly.
and make sure they're actually making a difference.
Right. They want to see USAID become much more evidence-based.
Okay, so more data, less guesswork.
Exactly.
And they also keep talking about faith-based organizations in global health.
Yes. That's a big theme for them.
They seem to think they're the key.
They do. They argue that faith-based groups are often the most effective healthcare providers in developing countries.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, they often have these really established networks.
Okay.
They're already working in these communities.
Uh-huh.
They have the trust of the people,
Okay.
and they're often really dedicated to serving the poor and marginalized.
I see. So it's about leveraging those existing relationships.
Right.
So it's local, it's faith-based, it's results-oriented.
Yeah, that's kind of their mantra.
But it sounds like they're not big fans of the big top-down approaches.
No, not at all, especially when it comes to humanitarian assistance.
What do they have to say about that?
They're very critical of how USAID handles humanitarian aid.
Okay.
They say they spend way too much money on these chronic man-made crises,
Uh-huh.
and that a lot of times the aid actually does more harm than good.
Really? That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, but they have some examples.
Like what?
They point to places like Syria and Yemen,
Right.
Afghanistan, where billions of dollars have been spent.
Right.
But they say it hasn't really made a difference,
Mhm.
and that in some cases, the aid has actually made things worse.
How so?
Well, they argue that sometimes it ends up propping up corrupt regimes,
Okay.
or even inadvertently funding terrorist groups.
Wow, that's a scary thought.
It is. It's a very serious accusation.
So if throwing money at these problems isn't the answer,
Right.
what do they propose?
Well, they're calling for some pretty big changes.
Like what?
They want to see deep cuts to the humanitarian aid budget.
Right?
term limits on aid programs,
Interesting.
and surprise, surprise, more emphasis on local partners.
So they're really pushing this idea of empowering local communities.
Yeah, they think that's the key to sustainable development.
So less about handouts,
Right.
more about helping people help themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the private sector? I know they have some thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, they're big on the private sector.
What do they want to see happening there?
They basically think businesses should play a much bigger role in development
Okay.
than they currently do.
So less reliance on traditional aid.
Right, and more on private investment.
And how would that work?
Well, they talk about USAID partnering with businesses
Okay.
and investors
Uh-huh.
to create jobs and boost economies.
So it's like USA would act as a matchmaker,
Kind of.
connecting American businesses with opportunities in developing countries?
Exactly.
Okay, I see. And then there's this whole thing about branding.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
They seem to be pretty upset that American aid often goes unnoticed.
They are. They think America needs to do a better job of promoting its generosity.
So they want to see more, like, American flags on aid packages and stuff?
Not necessarily, but they do want to see stricter branding policies
Okay.
to make sure that all U.S. aid is clearly identified.
And they see this as more than just PR.
Right. They argue that it's about soft power.
Okay.
It's about projecting a positive image of America around the world.
So it's a way to win hearts and minds.
Exactly, and to build goodwill.
Okay, so we've talked about how they think USAID should work,
Right.
who they should partner with,
Yep.
what they should prioritize.
Yeah.
But how do they actually see all of this happening?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
They must have some ideas
Oh, they do.
about how to actually implement all of these changes.
They lay out a whole roadmap.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've seen how they want to basically revamp USAID,
Right.
change everything from their partners to what they focus on, and even how they present themselves.
Yeah, they have a very clear vision.
But how do they actually make all of these changes happen?
Well, now we get to the nitty-gritty, the actual plan.
USAID is a huge organization.
Oh, it's massive.
It's not really known for, being quick to change.
That's true. Bureaucracies can be pretty slow-moving.
So where do they even begin?
Well, they start with personnel.
Personnel.
They argue that to really change USAID, you need the right people in the right positions.
People who share their vision.
Exactly. People who are experienced but also ideologically aligned.
So they're not just talking about, like, a new administrator.
No, they're talking about a deeper change.
It's a whole new staff.
Well, they talk about using things like Schedule A and Schedule C appointments.
Look at those.
These are ways to hire people from outside the normal civil service system.
So you can bring in people who are more politically aligned.
Exactly.
So they want to kind of stack the deck with people who already agree with them.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, but personnel is just one part.
Right.
What about the actual structure of USAID? Do they want to change that too?
Oh, yeah. They have a whole section on restructuring, and it's pretty radical.
Okay, like what?
For example, they want to merge the Office of Budget and Resource Management with the Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning.
So basically combine policy and budgeting.
Exactly. They want to streamline things, reduce bureaucracy.
Make it more efficient,
Exactly.
but also, I'm guessing, make sure it's headed by someone who shares their views.
Right. That's a big part of it.
They also talk about giving more power to certain offices within USAID,
Uh-huh.
like the Office of Acquisition and Assistance, which handles all the procurement.
That's a big one.
And they want to, I imagine, shift away from those big NGOs and towards local and faith-based groups.
Right. That's their whole thing.
So they're really serious about breaking up what they call the aid industrial complex.
They see it as this, like, entrenched system that needs to be disrupted.
And they think changing who controls the money is the way to do it.
Exactly. It's all about shifting power.
Okay, so we've got personnel, we've got restructuring. What about the actual policies?
Oh, they have a lot to say about that, too. I bet they do. They want a full review and revision of USAID's policies.
Especially the ones related to climate change.
Climate change, DEI, gender equality, abortion.
All the hot-button issues.
Exactly. They even want to freeze any changes to the automated directive system.
Which is...
Basically, USAID's policy Bible, all the rules and regulations.
So they're hitting the pause button until they can get their own people and policies in place.
That's the idea. It's a pretty bold move.
It shows how serious they are about making big changes.
Yeah, they're not messing around.
Okay, but is any of this realistic?
Well, that's the big question, right?
I mean, even if they had a president who was fully on board with all of this,
Yeah.
there's going to be a ton of pushback.
Oh, absolutely. From inside USAID, from Congress.
And even if they overcome all of that, there's no guarantee that it'll actually work.
Right. Development is complicated.
It's not as simple as just having the right policies in place.
There are so many factors involved.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about.
We have. It's a really fascinating report.
And it raises a lot of important questions about America's role in the world.
And how we can best help other countries.
And whether it's even our place to be doing that.
Right. Those are big questions.
And I don't think there are any easy answers.
No, but it's a conversation we need to keep having.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into USAID.
It's been my pleasure.
We'll be back next time with another look at a complex and important issue